Welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we start Module 7, which is about form. Our first part is 7.1, repetition and expectation. Let's go ahead and look at the docket for today. Here's our plan for this lesson. We'll start with defining and talking about the labeling of form. Form is the larger sections in music and how they relate to each other. I will mention a famous quote from Heraclitus about a river, which relates to repetition, and we'll talk about the types of repetition. These are not really specific types that are universal, but more just ways of discussing how music can come back in the same work. And then finally, we'll talk about expectation and similarly some categories of expectations and surprises. As listeners, when we hear music, we expect certain things innately, and we'll talk about what those are and how they relate to our perception of form. So today we're talking about form. What is form in music? So that word means something different in some of the other arts, like in visual art, but in music, form refers to the definition and organization of sections of music and the relationships of those sections to one another. So for example, if a song starts with an introduction and then it goes into a verse and then it goes into a chorus and then back into a verse, that's what we call the form. So the form is not only the definitions of those sections, so where those sections start and end, but also how those sections relate to one another. So there are basically two ways to label and discuss form, and it's a little bit like Roman numerals versus chord symbols that we talked about in the last unit, but the two ways are: one, you can label each section of the music with a letter, and the letters just go from one to the next in the order that they appear. So the first section of music would be called A. We use a capital letter A for that. And then whatever the next section of music is, it's called B. And then after that, you could have another A, you could have another B, you could have a C. After C, you could have A, B, or C again, or a D. So there's a few advantages to this system because in this system, which is used in classical music, and in some cases for pop and rock music and other music as well, some of the advantages are that the sections don't have to be any one thing or another. So a B section can be long or quiet or repetitive or anything. A C section can only happen once. It can happen 5 times. An A section can be the most important section or the least important section. So there's a flexibility to these labels. It just means these are the sections. The letters that they get are just about where they first occur, and then we map out the rest of the form by showing where they come back. And the other way of labeling form is with categories of sections like verse, chorus, bridge, outro, etc. Most of that we're going to be getting into in the next lesson. So in 7.2, we'll get more into what is a verse, what is a chorus, and all the fun that goes with that. Today we're just going to stick with the simple A, B, C, etc. So, thinking before we get into some types of sections or relationships, I want to just think for a moment about how do we know something is a section of music? In other words, how do we know where the line is between section A and section B? Or whether we're hearing 2 A's in a row or just one long A. I would say that a section of music is usually about 15 to 60 seconds in length. So if you just take like your average folk song, let's say it's 4 minutes long. most likely you would have about 4 or 5 sections in the song. Maybe it goes intro, verse, verse, chorus, back to the verse, or using A's and B's and C's, it might be A, B, B, C, B. Um, so the reason I wanted to speak on this for a moment is because it can be tricky when you're analyzing music to decide whether something counts as a new section or not. So there are no true hard and fast rules for this, other than a section should feel somewhat self contained. It should probably have some homogeneity or self similarity within the section. So if we hear a drastic change in virtually any level, probably that will signal a new section. So it should be self similar. And also, it usually has sort of a beginning and end rather than flowing right into the next section. Usually, there'll be a little bit of a sort of comma or even a period at the end of the section before the next one starts. So, try to avoid labeling music such that your sections A, B, C are all like more like 5 seconds in length. That's probably just part of a section. When we get to the end of next lesson, we'll be analyzing in real time some examples from Beach Boys songs, and there are cases in those songs and in a lot of songs where a single section, let's say A, has sort of two parts to it. How do we know whether those two parts are two parts of A or if it's A B? At the end of the day, there's probably going to be some debate on that, but at the simplest level, does it seem like it's a change within a larger section? Does it seem like the scenario is the same, even though there's been a change, for example, of harmony? Or does it seem like we've really gone somewhere new? And I know that a lot of that is kind of vague. That's the nature of the beast with form. So it's not something we're going to be testing in terms of labeling something. There's not going to be a specific right answer, but it's very interesting stuff. I find that some of the examples of music that I assumed had a very, very simple form, like ABA, ended up having something more complex, and vice versa. So let's see if there's anything else I need to say about what form is. The only other thing I wanted to mention is we're going to look at this in a second visually, but when you are thinking about these sections, what's the reason why we would want to label the sections of a piece of music? Why does it illuminate anything for us to see some piece of music reduced to A, B, C, B, A, for example? It doesn't necessarily reveal anything, but it might. One of the biggest elements that is showing is repetition. And by repetition, I just mean when a section comes back, either exactly the same or slightly differently. That is a big part of the way we communicate with music. If you think about other art forms like a movie or a poem or a dance, I hesitate to say that it never happens, but if you can think about in a movie where, for example, a 10-minute sequence from the movie actually happens exactly the same way again. There are some examples of that. I can think of a couple, but it's more rare. Same within a novel or in a poem, to have the same material come back again. That's something that's most common in music out of the art forms. Probably that's partly to do with the fact that music exists in time and we can't see it. And we might be able to see someone playing or see some notes, but the music itself is the vibrations of air, as we've talked about. So for us to experience the music, we often enjoy hearing something repeated because we don't still have a grasp of it. and we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when we repeat things. So we label things. Again, today we're going to be labeling A, B, C, etc. When something comes back, let's say it goes A, B, A. When something comes back, if it's exactly the same or almost exactly the same, we're just going to still call it the same thing. So ABA means basically that when the second A happened, it's the same as the first one. Maybe a couple notes or a couple words or some very slight twist happens, but it's basically the same. The other thing that can happen is we have an A come back, but the A is pretty significantly different. It's definitely still recognizable as being an A and not a C, but it's an A that's varied. When that happens, we write down an A with a little prime or an apostrophe, and that shows us that it's a varied repetition. So A, B, A, that A comes back exactly the same. A, B, A prime. A prime is still A, but with some more significant twists. It's a varied repetition. Let's look at some of this on paper or on the screen and talk a little more about it. So, as I've been talking about these A's and B's and C's, I wanted to go ahead and show some examples. So here's an example of a form. This is called an arch form, which I'll return to next time. It is A, B, C, B, A. So this means that we have a first section, a second section that's different, a third section that's different from both of those, and then a fourth section that's the same as the second one, and a fifth section that's just like the first one. Here's what the primes look like. You might remember this. We used a similar format when we talked about melodic phrase structure. Just to remind you, the melodic phrases basically works the same way. It's just that with melodic phrases, they are uncapitalized. So they're lowercase letters like this, A, B, A prime. So the larger case capital letters are for form. While I'm on that note, the melodic phrase structure, just so you know, probably occurs within one section. So we might have, let's say, an A section in the form where the melody goes A, B, A prime within that larger one section. So usually these definitely are longer. So this is pretty confusing looking. Maybe it looks like a sheep or a Swedish pop band. But I wanted to show some of the things that can happen with the primes and the different versions of the same section. So here we have A, B, A prime to start. Okay, so that means that the A prime is the same basic music as A, but it has enough variation in it that we decided to put a prime on it. So that would probably mean something like, let's say it starts the same way, but in the second half, it changes a little bit and uses different chords, for example, at the end. So it still feels like an A. It's not a C, but it has some significant differences. It makes it into an A prime. Okay, then we get a B. So this B is the same as the first B. Then we get an A, which is the same as the first A. So this is going to be like an exact repetition of this, whereas this one was a varied repetition. Then we get a B prime, so we get a varied repetition of B, but still B. And then finally an A double prime. That's what that would look like. So that'd be yet another version of A. So I just wanted to point out that that type of thing can happen. We can have not only variations of sections, but some of those returning verbatim and others, that are new variations. What you're basically looking for is the section to be essentially the same. So like the essence is the same, and yet there's just some more, some differences that make it worthy of a prime. Part of the reason that I'm being sort of vague is because this is sort of a vague art form in terms of labeling a song. Sometimes it's really easy, sometimes it's more complex. So today, what we're going to get into is a lot of the things that we can learn about song structure from form. So, why would we want to study form at all? Why would we be interested in breaking down a song that we like into A, B, C, B, A? So, we might not learn anything particularly useful from that, but we might because sometimes songs that seem very simple actually have something kind of complex going on. I mean, this is rather complex. It might be um, a little bit extra complex actually, but um, sometimes complex songs will have a very simple form. So we can learn from it by seeing how the sections relate to each other, how the dramatic arc of the music leads us through this. And on top of that, we might also find that other elements in the music, like the orchestration, meaning what instruments are used, don't necessarily align with this structure. Maybe there's kind of a different structure happening on that level. Maybe there's a different structure happening with the harmony, and we could compare that to the overall form. But one of the biggest things that we see, one of the main points of this, is to see repetition in music. So, probably more so than other art forms like poetry or movies, music contains a good amount of repetition. We know this. Not only pop and rock music and song structures, but classical music as well uses repeat symbols, and varied repetition, theme and variations. We're going to get into some of that. Let's first just talk a little bit about repetition itself. There's this famous maxim from Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher. It says, "No one ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and they're not the same person." So, what do you think this is getting at? What is Heraclitus' point here? So I would say that when we first hear the first half of this, no one ever steps in the same river twice. It kind of seems like he's implying that you don't actually physically go in the same river again, but actually he's saying that even if you do go in what is labeled on the map as the same river, it's not the same river because the rivers are interesting. They're sort of a pathway more than they are like a house is a physical object, but a river is a path that water flows through. Um, and, he adds to that in true philosopher form, you're not the same person you were when you stepped in the river before. Um, I think that relates well to music and how we hear repetition because repetition um, definitely is expected. We expect things to repeat, and when they do, the idea, relating this to the Heraclitus would be when we hear the last chorus of the song, it's not the same as hearing it for the first time. Let's say, like in a traditional song, you have a story that's told through a series of verses. So you have verse one, and the character finds a dog, and in verse two, he and the dog climb a mountain together. In verse three, the dog has puppies. And in between all three of those verses, you have a chorus, and you have a chorus at the end. And the who knows what the words to this chorus are, but the way that you perceive the chorus is not the same because of what's happened in the music or what's happened in the lyrics and the music. Um, so there'd be all kinds of examples of this. For example, if we find that something that the music has sort of morphed in a particular way, like it's become darker or stranger in the middle of the piece, if we were to come back to, let's say, a repeated section from the beginning of this piece that was happy, we might find that feels very different now that the music got stranger or darker in between. So, um, I want to talk about types of repetition. That's going to be one of our main things for this lesson. So, repetition, we've already talked about having, whoops, this is a typo. That should say A. So, we've already talked about um, having repetition in terms of um, verbatim repetition, meaning exactly the same. And number 3 here is varied repetition. So I wanted to try to get at some of the other types of repetition that we hear in music. Now, these are my own terms, so these are not necessarily like textbook terms, but they're certainly things that happen in music. So verbatim repetition just means it's performed exactly the same way, or almost exactly the same. So examples of this would be like a piece of music that has repeat signs. These are repeat signs in musical notation. So if you see these, then you're supposed to go back to the beginning and play it all the way through again. And presumably you play it exactly the same way. Nothing's changed in here there would be all the notes. Nothing's changed about the notes. So this is a verbatim repetition. So it would just be A again. It'd be A, A. Now we know that the performer might play the music it's subtly differently the second time, and that kind of relates to the Heraclitus quote, because when you're playing it the second time, you naturally will not play it exactly the same way. But the material is essentially the same. The nuts and bolts are identical, so it's a verbatim repetition. Keep in mind up here when I'm saying A, that's assuming we're talking about repeating an A. This could be a B and another B, but I just used A to represent that. Another example of verbatim repetition would be the chorus of a song, which usually repeats the same music and lyrics. So two choruses of a song are both A, or they're both B, unless they're altered. So the second type of repetition I wanted to talk about is strophic. So that is an older term for what we now talk about as verses. So a strophe is a verse where you have a new block of text that goes with the same music. So the way that we have music that comes back with the same words, that comes back with different words, but it's the same music, we can call that strophic repetition or verse repetition. So we have verse 1, the boy and the dog. Verse 2, they climb the mountain. So the music, traditionally in a verse, is the same music. So if there's a violin added, that doesn't really change the harmony and melody of the music. If the person sings a little flourish, that's still basically the same music. If they end on a different note, but the rest of the melody was the same, all of that would still be A, but we could call it A prime. In fact, I think this one could go kind of either way, whether you want to think about a verse as being A or A prime. Either way, the lyrics are what's different, and so that's a very classic and ancient type of repetition. We hear the same music come back, and we're happy to hear a return of something we know, and yet the story is developing on a lyrical level. So the third type is one we've already talked about, which is varied repetition. So as I said with the primes, a varied repetition, a varied repeat would be where the music comes back recognizably as being the same music, but with some variation. The variation could be huge or really small. If it's extremely small, we'll probably just consider it a verbatim repetition. But let's say that what could change in an A prime? What could change in a varied repetition? Well, we could have the same basic melody, but played on a different instrument in a different range, and it could be slower. So in that case, that's a varied repetition. There's a sameness of melody, but a difference in range, instrument, and tempo. So usually the distinction of whether it's still an A or whether it's a B has to do with the kind of, like I said, nuts and bolts of the music, like the melody for a verse or the melody for a chorus, and to some extent the harmony as well. The harmony will usually be the same, but there may be little twists. So here's another example of the primes and double primes. But we've already talked about that. Yeah, here I do note again that you can still have a verbatim repetition occur after you have varied repetitions. So here we have two varied repetitions, two distinct varied repetitions, and then you can have a verbatim repetition after that. So here's some examples of some varied repetition. We could have a written out repeat in the notated music, not using repeat signs. So by written out, I mean where you actually write the music again, and the material is essentially the same. The notes and rhythms are basically the same, but there are different instruments and slightly different harmony. So if there's slightly different harmony and different instruments, that's going to feel like a varied repetition. That's going to feel like an A prime. Here's another example. A section that returns, but it starts exactly the same as before, but with a completely different ending. So it's like, let's say you have the same chord progression for the first 5 measures, and then the last 3 measures, we have very different chords happen. But it still started out the same way. So we would call it an A, but it's an A prime. It's a varied repetition. So all of these first 3 I've labeled as A prime, and A prime. This one, I really think this actually could be A or A prime. It just kind of depends on whether you consider the lyrics to be different enough for it to change to A prime. But all of these are A. In the last couple that I came up with here in terms of talking about repetition, I wanted to speak a little bit to things that are not as close in terms of their correlation to the original material. So numbers 4 and 5 here, I've put B in because they are examples of quasi-repetition, but they're not close enough to be considered an A. So here's what I mean by transformation. A transformative repetition would be elements from a prior section which are significantly transformed in a new section. So compare this to varied repetition, which we talked about retaining many elements in common between the 2 sections, whereas transformation, it sounds completely different, but incorporates some elements from the prior section. So you might say, and you'll find this in music, that there'll be a section that has like one line or one melodic fragment that's in common with the A section, for example, but we still call it a B because it's just that one fragment that that they have in common. It's not the whole section. Yeah, it usually would sound like a different section, but it incorporates some element. So usually we'd mark this with a new section letter because it's not close enough. I came up with some more examples here. Here's one. A high, soft melody, which is heard clearly in the first section. It returns that melody secretly in a later section as a very slow version of itself in the bass register. So at first we hear a high, soft melody, and it's very clear. Later on in this music, we hear that same melody happen, but it's sort of secretly tucked in at a very low slow speed in a low register where other parts at the same time are fluttering about loudly above this bass sound. So the idea here is I'm just coming up with a case, I can think of one like this, where you have a melody that's very clear in an A section. Then later on we have a B section. It sounds really different overall. There's these parts fluttering around. But subtly and secretly in the bass, there is that melody happening again. So I would not call it an A prime, I would call it a B, because overall it's a very different section, but it does contain some element of transformative repetition. So there's some transformed version of the material that comes back. The melody contains the same intervals, but the formal section sounds different. Here's another example. We hear lyrics in the first verse of a song. Those same lyrics return in a brief section after the last chorus, except with different chords, different melody, and a different mood. So here in this example, the element of lyrics is retained while almost all the other elements are completely different. So it's like we have this line. Let's say it's, "I'll be back again." And that line, "I'll be back again," happens at the beginning of the first verse. When that line comes back, maybe it's a longer line than that. When that comes back at the end of the song, after the last chorus, it's those words again, but not the same music. So we'd still call it B or C or D. But it's a little bit of a repetition. It's a transformative repetition of that lyric. So we can have repetition without it really being a whole section that's repeated. That brings me to the last of these categories, which I'm calling loose correlation. Similarly, it's not the same section anymore, and this is the furthest away from a verbatim repetition. So this is just where sections share some common elements or some other relationship that connects them, but the music is actually different. So this would also be marked with a new section letter. Here's some examples of what I mean. So I'm talking about two sections that have a correlation, a kind of feeling of repetition, but without actual literal repetition. So let's say that we have a song and it starts, so far we've only heard verses, A prime, A double prime, and choruses, B. And a new section happens that we can call C, and it sounds very similar to the verse in melody, vocal style, and the types of chords. So it's like we're going verse, let's say it goes A, B, A prime, B, A double prime, B, C. So we've heard verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, and then C. And when we hear the C, it has a feeling of that it sounds like it's repeating A. Maybe even starts on the same chord, but it's not A. It's a new section, it's C. But the melody, the vocal style, the types of chords are similar to A. But when we get down to it at the end of the day, it's not A, it's C. It doesn't use the same melody. It's just a similar style. So here's another example of loose correlation, and then we'll move on to the next section of the lesson. A string quartet has a first section A with isolated individual notes. None of the instruments play at the same time. So we hear like something like that. Just individual notes on string instruments. Then we have a larger section B that's homophonic. Homophonic means where all the instruments play at the same time. So this is the opposite of A. Now we have a B section where all the instruments are playing together. Chords, beautiful counterpoint. And then we have a new section, C, that also contains somewhat isolated notes, similar to A, but the notes are different than before. They're more spread out in range, and the new isolated notes form a melody between them, a Hocket melody, which is where multiple parts create one melody together. So like the previous example, this is a case where there's a feeling of repetition, like we came back to A in form, but we didn't actually come back to A. We just came back to a new section that shares a loose correlation with A, and we're going to call it C because it's not the same music, it's not the same melody, but it has this correlation. So just to review, music comes back in a lot of different ways. It can come back exactly the same, it can come back with one element changed, or with a variety of small elements changed. Or it can quasi come back in a transformed version as part of a new section. Or we can have even just the suggestion of the music coming back without it actually coming back. So that's a lot of info about different ways that music can come back, but I think it's one of the most essential elements of music. The way that we hear things and we hear them come back and we hear them change and develop like characters in a story. The other half of today's lesson is going to be about expectation. So when we think about form, we can think about, okay, we have these formal sections and we have the ways that they relate to each other and the ways that they repeat and the order. A lot of what those sections are doing is playing on our expectations. So this is something you hear talked about a lot in a music theory class or possibly between songwriters. It's also something that is very much intuitive and hard to put our finger on. So expectation would be, as a listener, I'm listening to this song and I expect that certain things will happen. I expect things won't happen. I'm probably not even consciously aware of exactly what my expectations are, but they're there. And that's what allows for surprise. I'm thinking maybe I could compare it to like a robot or a computer listening to music. It's analyzing things. It says, this is how many notes we had per minute. This is the tempo of the song. The computer or robot is able to analyze the song to some extent. But it doesn't necessarily pick up on expectation and surprise in the way that humans would, because we have an intuitive sense. So we have a sense that if something we felt that it was supposed to happen and it didn't happen, and so we're surprised. I don't really know if I can speak for the computers. I don't know where the computers are at nowadays. Maybe they would be surprised too. But I think that the reason I'm bringing it up is that it's not necessarily something that we actively think about, but it's kind of the under layer for how we experience music. So we're going along, we're listening to each section as it happens. Do we want to have our expectations met? Do we want to be surprised? Both. Obviously, some of this is a matter of taste, like many things in this class. But there are some expectations that are not necessarily just personal taste, and they more have to do with instinct, our brain's predictive ability to expect something to happen, and they have to do with cultural norms and traditions. So there are some things that we can talk about with expectation. If you disagree with these, I'm happy to hear from you. We all have different experiences of music, that's for sure. But let's talk a little bit about how we can describe what we expect in music. So I came up with some categories for expectation. These are my own labels. These are concepts that are important to music, but these are not known labels necessarily. They're just ways that I came up with for describing these phenomena. So first is expectation of prior trajectory. So again, we're talking about expectations that probably we all pretty much share. It's not really a taste thing, but it's more of a inherent intuitive drive toward not necessarily wanting something to happen, but expecting it to. So, I mean, a good example would be um, we expect that if you're halfway through the verse of a song, halfway through the line of that verse, that you would finish the line and finish the verse. If there's an explosion sound and then someone else starts singing, that's going to be definitely a surprise to our expectations. Um, so, prior trajectory, what I mean here is that we expect the elements of the music to unfold in a certain way, and we expect them to unfold in a similar way to how they already unfolded before. So, if we take the example of varied repetition, we have an A that happens. Let's say we have two verbatim A's that happen at the beginning. We have A, B, and then we start to hear an A again, but it actually turns out to be an A prime where there are different chords at the end. That would be a sidestepping of our expectation of prior trajectory. So keep in mind that, as songwriters or listeners of music, we all know that expectations and surprise are kind of both part of the scenario. That's why I wanted to talk about it. It's not a question of taste, really. It's about a balance between meeting expectations and deceiving or surprising them. Um, so, we expect things to continue along their prior trajectory, to continue the way they started or the way they were before. Similarly, inertia, it's almost the same thing, and there's going to be some overlap between these, but an expectation of inertia, what I mean by this is more that from moment to moment, we expect some consistency of the elements. So when a section of music is building up louder and louder, we expect it to reach a loud climax. If it suddenly drops to a very quiet volume, our expectations are obviously surprised. So I would consider that more of the inertia that's built up. So maybe the example that I gave a minute ago of something blowing up and someone else starting to sing, that might be a surprise on multiple levels. By prior trajectory, I just mean that the way that things happened before, we expect them to happen that way again. Whereas the inertia is more of a moment to moment. We just expect that the same person's going to be singing a second later. So here's an example with that. A singer with a low voice has already sung 3 verses. If another verse occurs, we expect the same singer to deliver it. If we have a different singer with a high voice entering in on the 4th verse, that would be surprising. So I'm going to go through these pretty quick because I just want you to be thinking about these different categories of expectations. We don't need to find a ton of examples for all of them. So all of the elements of music, like rhythm, harmony, etc., would have kind of some inherent expectations too. And they're interesting because some of them are personal, some of them are stylistic, like we expect jazz to sound a certain way rhythmically, we expect rock to do certain things with rhythm, but some of them are more on the kind of inherent brain level. So one of those is we expect kind of a consistent tempo. So we can hear any tempo, but a tempo change is inherently surprising, especially if it's significant. Naturally, music kind of floats around, moving a few beats per minute back and forth, slowing down for just a second. But if you have a change of tempo, that is definitely going to be surprising. We expect tempo to stay consistent. Meter, most of the time we expect that to stay the same as well. We're talking about time signature, 4/4. If it switches into 6/8, that's definitely going to be surprising. We expect a consistent type of subdivisions, so whether we have 2 or 3 notes that subdivide the beat, or whether we have a swing or not. If we have a swing, we expect it to stay consistent. If we don't have one, it's going to sound surprising when swing starts. So, additionally, there's commonly an expectation of symmetrical rhythms and meters that are powers of two, at least in Western music. So, um, again, I think this is interesting for us all to think about in comparison to taste. So, if someone says, I only like music in 4/4, or if you have a friend that's really into progressive music or experimental music and they say, oh, I hate all music in 4/4, those are both opinions. That's taste. um, but I'm not talking about taste here. I'm talking about um, we have an expectation of symmetrical rhythms because the way that we hear tempo relationships is exponential or logarithmic. So the same is true for pitch. We know that um, pitches that are powers of two apart are octaves. So we hear that relationship for sure in all cultures. Not that the octave is always treated the same way, but it pretty much exists in 99.9% of tuning systems. And just like the octave, a relationship of rhythm between a half note and a quarter note, or between a quarter note and an eighth note, is something that is not just a matter of taste, it's built into the way we understand rhythm. While we're at it, the same thing is true of volume. We actually hear volume exponentially as well. So when we hear the volume, twice as much volume sounds to us like kind of one step of volume. Um, so, so we expect that the rhythm can be and will be divided into twos. Another way of saying that is powers of two. So half note, quarter note, eighth note, 16th note. All of those are, continuing to divide in half. Um, so those are some things that we expect about rhythm. If we compare that to 5/4, which is an asymmetrical meter, we can divide the quarter notes into two and so on, but the overall measure can't be divided equally into two, or it can be, but not continuously. It would be divided with a lopsided amount, or would not continue to divide in the same way that 4 would. And similarly, with a compound meter like 6/8, where each beat is divided into three, then that also is not exactly what we expect. We certainly get used to it, and we enjoy it, but we expect that a beat will be divided into 2 or 4 parts, not into 5 parts necessarily. Okay, so a little typo there. Okay, so melody. Melody, we expect certain things on a melodic horizontal level that have to do with patterns within a piece of music and just patterns that are built into scales. So if we take a major scale, for example, and I were to sing this, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Even someone who's not trained in music, they don't have to know what the words mean. They would probably have an expectation that I would continue one more note and resolve that. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And that is not totally universal, and all scales are different around the world. But there is a reason for that, and it has to do with the way this scale is built. It's built, if you remember from when we talked about scales, to have whole steps and half steps. And it has whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. So there are, you could say, 5 whole steps and 2 half steps. The half steps are not necessarily more important, but they cue us as to where we are in the scale. Because if we had all whole steps, like the whole tone scale, da 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 da, there's no half steps in that. It's only 6 notes, and there's no way to know where you are, where the bottom of the scale is, for example. The half steps, partly what they do is show us where we are in the key. Either we're on fa to mi or ti to do. So these two of these melodic notes are called tendency tones. Tendency tones are fa and ti in a major key. And they're called that because they have a tendency, or you might even say a desire, to move to another note. Fa wants to resolve to mi, and ti wants to resolve to do. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Ti wants to push up a half step, ti, do, whereas fa wants to resolve to mi. You can think about that as there's a dissonance between fa and ti. There's a tritone dissonance between those two. They're not found in the one chord. And do and mi are a consonance between them, a third or a sixth, that is found in the one chord. So these tendency tones, we have an expectation that they will resolve. I'll sing an example. If I were to do, mi, fa, mi, re, sol, ti. If I ended the melody there on ti, we would have the sense that it wants to resolve up. So we have an expectation that it wants to go ti, do. So even if that doesn't happen, there's a built-in expectation there. You'll often have melodies that do that, and then usually they'll resolve to do in the next phrase. So I could try one with fa as well. Do, la, do, re, mi, do, la, do, mi, fa. It kind of wants to come back down. Fa, mi, do, mi, fa, mi. It's okay if you don't necessarily hear it that way, but it's one of the ways that we get expectations for melody. The other way is just by whatever's happened in the music already, we expect the patterns from within the work to continue. Harmony, we have expectations in terms of harmony. I'm just going to give the most classic example, but we don't have to get too deep into it. But harmony, similarly with melody, we have the one chord, right? In a key, we have the one chord, and we would expect the music to return back to a one chord at some point. So in a five chord is often what happens right before the one chord. The five chord, if we just stay on the five chord, we expect it'll go back to a one chord. Now I'm just going to mention this for those who are interested. It's called the deceptive cadence. Deceptive cadence. That's where instead of going from a five chord to a one chord, we go from a five chord to a six chord. This is not required info. I just wanted to point this out. So here, if I sing, this is what we expect. Do, sol, ti, re should go to do, mi. So sol, ti, re, it's a five chord. Do, mi, sol, that's a one chord. If we do this instead, sol, ti, re, la, do, mi, what happens is we have two notes that were in common between the 1 and 6 chords, do and mi, but we have the bottom voice go to la instead of do. Just to boil that down, this is an example of a harmonic expectation and what is called deception, where we evade what we expect by just changing one note of the chord to give us a different chord. Then finally, we do have some expectations of form itself. On a form level, we expect sections to occur in the same sequences. If we have verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, and then we have another verse, we expect a chorus to come afterward. All of that kind of feeds into the first two on this list as well, the expectations of inertia and prior trajectory. But we expect the sequences to be kept. So often a bridge in a song, which we'll get to next time, is kind of a surprise because we didn't necessarily see that coming, that there was going to be this third section of music called the bridge that was not a verse or a chorus, and that can be surprising. So, to wrap this up, I know that a lot of this material is quite vague, and also it's just it applies to pretty much all music, and so therefore it's not very specific. But if we think about for a minute how form and repetition and expectation are used in songs or in music, there's not really going to be one answer to that. If we think, is there such a thing as too much repetition? I'd say we'd all probably agree that yes, there is such a thing as too much repetition. Um, but what about if we have no repetition at all and we have what we'll talk about next time as through composed music, which just goes from a new thing to a new thing to a new thing and it never comes back? Well, that might be a little too far in that direction as well. So often it seems that most listeners and songwriters prefer a balance where we have things repeat but with a twist. We have varied repetition. We have things that are new but they sound like old things, sort of like a loose correlation. And we have a kind of going back and forth between new and old material throughout a song. So, what about expectations? Do you think those should be met most of the time, or all the time, or once in a while, or never? It's pretty hard to surprise a listener constantly because the act of surprise will kind of become the norm. On the other hand, if we meet the expectations all of the time, we might have something kind of saccharine and cheesy. And I do like a lot of cheesy music, along with a lot of very not cheesy music. But, we might have something that's just so in the pocket and so normal that might be not what we're going for as a creator. So the expectations probably want to be met some of the time, or maybe most of the time. And now this is just my personal opinion. I would be curious to hear from you all as well, but my personal opinion is that the expectations should usually be met on some levels throughout, while others are surprised. So for example, like if I were to write a piece of music where I wanted, let's say it's guitar and voice, and suddenly I want to sing much higher than I was singing before. So I'm going to jump up and we have a shock of, or a surprise in terms of the range. What I find is that if you can meet some of the expectations at the moments that you are evading other expectations, that creates kind of a nice balance. Another way of saying that would be to sort of dovetail, or if you can imagine like two long Lego pieces and you connect them about halfway through so that 4 of the dots are connected. If you basically connect some of the material, not necessarily all of it, I feel that for us to appreciate a surprising moment, we need something to grab onto. And maybe if the lyrics are going to change, maybe that's why verses are what they are. The lyrics are different, so we need the rest of the music to be pretty consistent in order to follow that. It's a gross oversimplification, but it is something to think about. So I think in general it's a balance. And finally, I was just thinking, is the form of a musical work devised before the composing? So does someone figure out, I want to go A, B, A, C, A? I would say that, of course, it's been done either way. And we're going to get more into this when we get to the next module on composition. But I would say that the order, these forms that we're studying, that we look at, A, B, A, verse, chorus, verse, they are probably best when they are born out of the music itself, meaning there are some types of verses that just really want a chorus to come after them. And there are other types of verses that just kind of want to loop back into another verse. And if you were to write a verse, then it's possible that the verse might suggest to you whether it needs a chorus right after it. Maybe you try playing verse, chorus twice, and then just ask yourself, do we need another section, or is the song over? So I think it can be a lot of fun. I usually suggest that you, if you're interested in writing a form or writing a song, make a plan, but then let yourself change the plan. So I think having the plan in the beginning or at all really helps, but let yourself change the plan if you want to. So maybe you think, okay, I'm going to write an A, B, A, C, A, and then go ahead and let yourself put another B in there if it seems like it needs that. Okay, so let's wrap things up. So to wrap up for today, I decided not to put many musical examples in this section because partly I want us to, in the next lesson, look more in depth at some cases, but also because I just didn't want it to get too long listening to a song, for example, that has a lot of verbatim repetition. I think we all know what that sounds like. It's where the same exact thing happens again. So there's extra stuff on our class playlist that is not on the listening examples, and I think you could have some fun kind of reflecting on some of those in terms of, do they use varied repetition? What are my expectations, etc. And there's one that is on the listening examples, which is Mr. Bungle, None of Them Knew They Were Robots, that I think is very surprising. And it might be interesting to think about what is held in common there. It's a piece that has a lot of evaded expectations. So is there anything that is in common? Is there any kind of logic to it as it moves along? Okay, well, thanks for joining us for this lesson. When we come back, it'll be getting into verses and choruses and the details of forms. Have a great day.